Harlem in the late 1960s was alive with music, ambition, and danger. The streets were crowded, vibrant, and ruthless, ruled by fear, survival, and old alliances. Yet among the chaos, one man moved differently. Frank Lucas walked openly, lived plainly, and spoke softly. But he controlled an empire that rivaled anything the mafia had ever built. To the casual observer, Lucas was ordinary. A father, a churchgoer, a familiar face in his neighborhood. To those who understood power, he was a strategist who operated in silence, building influence through loyalty, discipline, and intelligence. His empire was quiet but absolute. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you love true crime cases, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Frank Lucas, born in 1930 in La Grange, North Carolina, Lucas was one of 10 children. Poverty shaped him, teaching lessons in patience, observation, and resilience. He understood human behavior early, how fear drives action, how scarcity shapes decisions, and how opportunity can appear unnoticed in plain sight. These lessons became the foundation of his future power. In his teens, Lucas moved north, drifting between jobs and cities until he settled in Harlem. The neighborhood was a battlefield. Gangs fought over territory, dealers thrived on violence, and law enforcement struggled to maintain control. Lucas observed carefully, realizing that survival and influence required more than brute force. Intelligence, timing, and the ability to read people could create power where muscle alone could not. Lucas worked under Bumpy Johnson, a legendary Harlem figure, learning the value of discretion, loyalty, and strategic thinking. Bumpy emphasized that violence was only a tool, not a solution. Frank internalized this lesson. He realized that the most effective power could be exerted without fanfare, through careful planning and subtle influence rather than visible domination. By the late 1960s, Lucas recognized inefficiencies in Harlem's heroin trade. Supply chains were convoluted, quality inconsistent, and prices inflated by multiple middlemen. Competitors relied heavily on intimidation, creating gaps in the market. Lucas devised a system that would bypass the middlemen entirely, import heroin directly from Southeast Asia, maintain quality, and brand the product. The result was Blue Magic, a heroin brand that promised purity and reliability. Dealers and users gravitated toward it. Lucas recruited trusted associates, trained them in rules and discretion, and minimized the use of violence. Harlem's streets, once chaotic and unpredictable, began operating under his quiet, invisible control. Lucas ran his empire like a corporation. Shipments were tracked, finances were monitored, and personnel followed strict rules. Loyalty was rewarded, betrayal met with consequences, delivered discreetly. To law enforcement, he remained a neighborly figure. To associates, he was a strategist who commanded respect without raising suspicion. By the early 1970s, Lucas had expanded beyond Harlem, influencing cities like Philadelphia and parts of New Jersey. His silent empire was more efficient than the mafia's, undercutting their power while maintaining minimal conflict. Harlem had a new ruler, but one who operated in silence rather than spectacle, a man whose greatest weapon was not force, but control, discretion, and absolute operational precision. Frank Lucas understood the rules of power better than anyone on the streets. Control the supply, control the market. The traditional heroin trade in New York relied on multiple middlemen, each cutting the product and inflating prices. The mafia dominated these networks with muscle, intimidation, and territorial control, but Frank saw a way to make them irrelevant. He established direct connections to suppliers in Southeast Asia, sourcing heroin straight from the Golden Triangle. This was a bold move. It bypassed decades of mafia dominance, but Lucas approached it strategically. He cultivated trusted partners who valued loyalty and discretion, ensuring that the operation remained invisible to competitors and law enforcement. By cutting out the middlemen, Lucas created a product that was purer, cheaper, and more reliable than anything the mafia offered. Blue magic became a symbol of consistency. Dealers trusted it, users demanded it, and slowly, the mafia's influence began to wane. Harlem streets shifted without a single public confrontation. The power was asserted silently, through reliability and efficiency. Lucas's genius was not just in sourcing heroin, but in logistics and organization. Every shipment was tracked meticulously, every dealer trained in rules, and every transaction monitored. Associates were held accountable for mistakes, loyalty was rewarded, and betrayal met discreet but decisive consequences. Violence was used sparingly. Discipline and strategy were the primary tools of control. This system created an empire that operated like a business. Supplies were predictable, distribution was consistent, and profits flowed steadily. Unlike the mafia, which relied heavily on fear and public displays of power, Lucas relied on efficiency, precision, and human psychology. He understood that control built on trust and predictability lasted longer than control built on intimidation. The mafia struggled to respond. Their old suppliers had been bypassed, their middlemen cut out, and their influence in Harlem eroded. Violence, their usual answer to competition, was ineffective. Dealers abandoned mafia channels in favor of blue magic because it was profitable, safe, and reliable. Without supply or loyalty, the mafia became powerless in the streets Lucas controlled. Lucas also reinforced loyalty through subtle management. Associates were carefully vetted, trained, and observed. The system discouraged mistakes and betrayal while rewarding efficiency and discretion. By combining operational control with psychological insight, Lucas built a network that was resilient, adaptable, and largely invisible. By 1972, his empire extended beyond Harlem, creating a distribution system that rivals and law enforcement alike struggled to understand. The mafia, once untouchable, was sidelined. Lucas had done what few believed possible. He built a criminal empire that dominated a major market, all through silence, strategy, and impeccable organization, rather than violence. Harlem had changed. Dealers and users shifted loyalty, crime bosses adjusted, and a new order quietly took hold. Frank Lucas had proven that a criminal empire could operate efficiently, invisibly, and with precision, a model that outsmarted the old powers and rendered them obsolete without a single public show of force. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas's empire had grown far beyond Harlem. Philadelphia, parts of New Jersey, and other cities now relied on his network. The system he had built, direct supply, disciplined distribution, and operational invisibility, was more efficient than anything the mafia had ever created. He had outsmarted one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America without a single public confrontation. Expansion brought new challenges. More associates meant more human risk. Mistakes could be catastrophic, and loyalty could waver under pressure. Lucas understood that even the most intelligent network could collapse if human unpredictability was not carefully managed. To maintain control, he implemented strict discipline. Every associate had defined roles and responsibilities. Shipments were compartmentalized so no one person knew the full operation. Communication was discreet. Loyalty was rewarded with wealth and security. Betrayal met with quiet, precise consequences. This approach minimized exposure and reinforced trust within the organization. Lucas also understood the importance of public invisibility. In Harlem, he remained a familiar, ordinary figure, a father, a neighbor, a churchgoer. To outsiders and law enforcement, he was unremarkable. But behind the scenes, he controlled an empire with precision. His dual life, publicly ordinary, privately omnipresent, was key to maintaining secrecy and avoiding scrutiny. Law enforcement began noticing changes on the streets. The mafia's influence was waning, but drug use and trafficking persisted. Investigators were puzzled by the efficiency of the network and the lack of violence. Lucas had created a system where the operation ran smoothly, quietly, and with minimal exposure. Even as agencies deployed surveillance and informants, they struggled to trace the network back to him. Meanwhile, rival gangs and former mafia allies watched in frustration. They could not compete with Lucas's system of supply and discipline. Violence would not reclaim the streets, and the loyalty of dealers and users was now firmly with Blue Magic. Lucas had established dominance not through fear but through reliability, strategic management, and foresight. By maintaining operational security, managing human risk, and expanding strategically, Lucas built an empire that functioned almost like a corporation. Every shipment, every dealer, every transaction was part of a controlled system. Mistakes were rare, and disruptions were quickly corrected. The streets operated under his silent oversight, making the mafia powerless and law enforcement perpetually a step behind. Frank Lucas had demonstrated a new kind of criminal mastery, power built on discipline, invisibility, and intelligence rather than violence. Harlem had a ruler who demanded no loyalty through fear. He earned it through efficiency, reliability, and subtle control. And as his empire grew, the lesson became clear. True power often works quietly, unseen, and unchallenged, until external forces force it into the open. By the mid-1970s, Frank Lucas's empire had reached unprecedented heights. Blue magic flowed from Harlem to Philadelphia and beyond, and the mafia had been sidelined. Yet even the most disciplined, silent operation is not immune to risk. For Lucas, threats emerged not only from outside forces but from the very people who had helped build his empire. As the organization expanded, human risk became increasingly difficult to control. New associates were recruited, and while loyalty had been the cornerstone of the operation, pressure from law enforcement and personal greed introduced vulnerabilities. Even the most disciplined individuals could be tempted, coerced, or make mistakes that threatened the entire network. Law enforcement had taken notice. The DEA, FBI, and local police recognized the scale and sophistication of the network and began deploying informants, surveillance, and undercover operations. Lucas had built operational invisibility, but the sheer size of the operation meant there were now points of exposure. Every shipment, every transaction, every new associate was a potential window for detection. The first significant cracks appeared when key associates were arrested or questioned. Facing long prison sentences, some began cooperating with authorities. Information about shipment routes, personnel, and operations started to leak. For the first time, Lucas's network faced internal vulnerabilities that could not be controlled with strategy alone. Even as law enforcement pressure grew, Lucas remained calm, relying on the discipline and compartmentalization he had instilled in his organization. Sensitive operations were rerouted, critical shipments were secured, and associates were monitored for loyalty. He understood that the empire he had built in silence was now exposed to forces beyond his control. Meanwhile, the streets began to feel the effects. The quiet order that had replaced mafia dominance showed signs of strain. Rival gangs watched for openings, internal disputes occasionally erupted, and law enforcement activity disrupted previously reliable channels. The very structure that had made his empire efficient now required constant attention to prevent collapse. Yet even under pressure, Lucas's ingenuity was evident. He adapted quickly, anticipating moves from authorities and rivals alike. He maintained secrecy, minimized exposure, and continued operations as best he could. But the cracks were growing, and it was only a matter of time before the empire built on silence would face its ultimate test. The story of Frank Lucas illustrates a paradox. The same discipline and intelligence that created dominance also exposes vulnerability. Human unpredictability, outside pressure, and the limits of secrecy are constants in any enterprise operating outside the law. The silent empire, which had made the mafia powerless, was now on the edge, awaiting the consequences of its unprecedented scale and audacity. By the late 1970s, the empire Frank Lucas had built in silence began to unravel. Federal authorities had gathered substantial evidence from surveillance, financial records, and most crucially, testimony from former associates. The very discipline and organization that had made Lucas untouchable now made him a prime target. His meticulous operations left a trail, and law enforcement was prepared to follow it. Arrests began quietly but decisively. Key lieutenants were taken into custody, and some agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. The network's carefully compartmentalized structure could not withstand the pressure of human vulnerability. Information about shipments, personnel, and finances leaked to authorities, exposing the once hidden operation. Lucas faced the full weight of the federal system. His empire, which had operated silently and efficiently, could not withstand coordinated scrutiny. The trial became a national story, highlighting the scale of his operation. Heroin imported directly from Southeast Asia, distribution networks spanning multiple cities, and the branding of Blue Magic as a trusted product. In court, Lucas maintained composure. He presented himself as a disciplined operator rather than a violent criminal, emphasizing that he had avoided unnecessary bloodshed and maintained order on the streets. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified, shipments were documented, and financial records demonstrated the empire's sophistication. Conviction was inevitable. Sentences were handed down. Associates were imprisoned or faced plea deals, and Lucas himself received a long term in federal prison. His empire, which had made the mafia powerless and operated in plain sight, collapsed almost overnight. The streets that had once been orderly under his control returned to chaos. Rival gangs fought for territory, violence surged, and the temporary stability imposed by Lucas disappeared. The mafia, though previously weakened, observed the collapse carefully. They had been sidelined by a man who built dominance quietly, without gunfights or public intimidation. Now, they learned from the consequences. Even brilliance and strategy cannot prevent exposure when human weakness and law enforcement intersect. Yet despite the collapse, Lucas's influence persisted in other ways. Law enforcement analyzed his organizational methods, noting that efficiency, compartmentalization, and loyalty management had allowed him to dominate a market that was previously controlled by fear and violence. Criminologists studied his operation as an example of how discipline and intelligence can outperform traditional power structures in criminal enterprises. Harlem felt the void immediately. Violence returned, disorder returned, and the community lost the quiet structure that had, paradoxically, maintained relative stability. Lucas's silent control had reshaped the streets, and its absence left a lasting mark. The fall of Frank Lucas demonstrates a harsh truth. Even the most carefully constructed empire, built on intelligence, loyalty, and operational precision, is vulnerable to exposure. Silence can protect power for a time, but human unpredictability, legal scrutiny, and betrayal remain constants that no strategy can fully eliminate. After serving a substantial portion of his sentence, Frank Lucas returned to Harlem a changed man. The streets he had once controlled, quiet, disciplined, and predictable, had shifted. Rival gangs filled the void, violence returned, and the temporary order he had imposed vanished. Yet Lucas understood that the empire he had built was never just about drugs. It was a study in human behavior, strategy, and the balance of power. In his later years, Lucas kept a low profile. He occasionally spoke to journalists or appeared in documentaries, offering reflections on the rise and fall of his empire. He discussed the importance of loyalty, discipline, and foresight, emphasizing the lessons of human management and strategic planning rather than glorifying his criminal past. His legacy is dual, operational and cultural. Operationally, he demonstrated that criminal enterprises could function like businesses. By sourcing heroin directly from Southeast Asia, controlling quality, branding his product, and training associates to follow strict operational rules, He minimized inefficiency, internal conflict, and exposure. Law enforcement and criminologists later studied his methods to understand organized crime and human behavior in high-stakes environments. Culturally, Lucas became a symbol of intelligence and audacity. Movies, books, and documentaries immortalized his story, portraying him as a man who outsmarted the mafia without firing a single dramatic shot. Harlem remembered him not only as a criminal, but as a figure who imposed a strange order on chaotic streets. Lucas also reflected on the human cost of his empire: associates imprisoned or dead, families affected, and communities disrupted. He acknowledged mistakes and accepted responsibility, emphasizing that no matter how clever, an empire built on silence is still vulnerable to betrayal, law enforcement, and human unpredictability. Frank Lucas passed away in 2019, but his story continues to instruct. He had made the mafia powerless, created an empire of silence, and dominated a market through intelligence, discipline, and foresight. Yet he also faced the inevitable consequence. Even the best systems cannot resist the pressures of exposure indefinitely. The key lesson of Lucas's life is clear. Power built on strategy, discipline, and intelligence can achieve extraordinary influence, often without violence or spectacle. Silence, discretion, and operational efficiency are as powerful as fear, sometimes more so. But no empire, no matter how clever, is invulnerable to human nature and the law. In the end, Frank Lucas teaches that mastery of people, systems, and opportunity can redefine power in any environment. He did not merely run the streets of Harlem. He studied them, controlled them, and left a legacy that continues to influence the study of organized crime and human behavior. Frank Lucas's empire may have fallen, but the lessons of his silence endure. Strategy, discretion, and intelligence are the quietest, and sometimes the most unstoppable forces of all.